Bear with us just a few more moments. We are both streaming live and recording this session, so we have a little bit. Say, bear with us while our AV person is setting up. We're both live streaming and recording this presentation, so give us 2 more minutes. Okay. Good morning. Thank you for staying after service this morning. My name is Ellen Procopo, and I work with Jean Goldberg and Dick Machin on the Forum Committee. We're delighted this morning to have you come and listen to our speakers. They seasonal residents between Chicago and Naples. How many people here from the Midwest? That would be, I was not expecting that response. Okay. Joyce Schrager and June Sochen, sorry. June is an adult educator who has lectured and taught classes on current events for many decades. They've spoken here many times before, and she focuses on national and international affairs. June is a retired history professor, author, and editor of 14 books. We're looking at an expanded definition of what is war, the hot wars of Ukraine and Israel, the culture war in Florida. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I turn it over to them.
Because you are so astute, you stole my first line. That was just fabulous. Thank you so much. I was going to acknowledge Ellen and Jean for doing all the preparations necessary for this morning. We are thrilled to be here, and we want to acknowledge a previous member of your program team, and that's Marge Ostrom, who's sitting in the second row. Would you raise your hand, Marge? Because it is Marge who discovered us. And I think that should be acknowledged. In 2012, June was writing various comments for the Naples Daily News. And Marge read one of her astute columns and said, I'd like to have this person come as a speaker. There are people in the room shaking heads. I've seen them before, and they've been here since the 2012 beginning. And so we were invited then, and she was invited then. A few years later, I was added to the team. My partner is June Sochen. I'm Joyce Schrager. Just for those who aren't aware of it.
We'll celebrate Marge's 90th birthday.
Oh. Thank you. That is very important. I wasn't sure that you wanted that known. But you should. You absolutely should. Well, because you're terrific. And we've all recognized each other. That's also very important. We're recognizable. But the concept of both hot wars and in our narrow definition of cold wars. Hot wars, obviously, Russia, Ukraine, Hamas, Israel. And I'll explain in a moment why I frame it that way. But Cold War, a narrow Cold War, are culture wars, wars of words, which you have here in Florida. Words, obviously, can also lead to action and violence and other things. But the hot wars that are persistent across the globe. There isn't a continent that doesn't have one or more wars. An article recently in the Washington Post suggested that Syria, that small country of Syria in the Middle East, has 5 distinct different wars. You have Russia working with Syria in the north, in the northwest, against the rebels who have been trying to overthrow the government. You have the Syrian government in the east shooting at the Kurds. You have others in parts of Syria looking at the ISIS and a variety of militant Muslim groups. 5 distinct different outbursts of violence, people being killed, cities being decimated, and I think a much neglected subject of all of these wars across the globe is the refugee crisis that is created. We are in the midst of the worst refugee crisis the world has seen since the end of the Second World War, by far. Think about just the conflicts we will talk about today and the kind of refugee crisis that has been begun. And it is internal refugees, because they're leaving their own homes, as well as external, leaving the country. And we know the situation in Gaza, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so all over there is this difficulty. But in Florida, to compete with the theme you are asking for the year, where is Florida heading? Florida is in the midst of a war of words. At the moment, it's just wars of words. Culture wars, political wars, social wars. But I, in my antic kind of mind, wanted to expand this worrisome thought that war is so persistent in our cultures today that it has entered the vocabulary of politics, and it's entered the vocabulary just of our social dialogue. For example, we no longer just talk about swing states, we talk about battleground states. We don't talk about political opponents or adversaries, we talk about political enemies. Enemy is a word of war, of a foreign invader, but we use it internally. Words, institutions, issues are weaponized. We talk about marshaling our weapons, our ammunition to fight our opponent, our enemy. Think about that language. Ammunition, all kinds of things that need to be done. Talk to your troops. And I've even gone a step further to think about innocent words that have now the coloration of war. Namely, think about a few things. Helicopter parent. I would think that it was an innocent comment, but when I think about a helicopter, I think about war. Even the simple word underground. What do I see when I hear the word underground? I see tunnels. Tunnels. A tool of war. And then my final little example, and there are many other you can have, when you tell a joke, you often have a punchline.
I didn't know that was going to be the end of that comment. I'm going to begin with a witticism from my favorite pessimist, Henry Adams. I expected the worst, and it's worse than I expected. And unfortunately, that's the way I feel these days. We are living in very fraught times. And my topic, firstly, is Florida. Now, I never contradict my sister, except when I do. The war of words, and I understand last week your speaker talked about banning books in Florida. I was going to mention the fact that the culture wars are just a very small part of the much larger war that Ron DeSantis and his supine supermajority Republican legislature is waging in Florida. And that is because I am going to talk about states' rights. Ron DeSantis is an aggressive believer and practitioner of states' rights. States' rights has had a long and ugly history in America. It's a very dangerous ideology when it's carried to an extreme. I'll give you a quick history lesson. The first example is the Articles of Confederation. Raise your hand if you know what the Articles of Confederation is. Okay, we have only a few, okay. And the overwhelming majority are the way the overwhelming majority are in this country, including Ron DeSantis, who is a history major at Yale. He clearly doesn't know about the Articles of Confederation. Or if he does, he's rejected them. The Articles of Confederation was the first governing body of the 13 colonies. When the 13 colonies waged war against Great Britain, they created the Articles of Confederation to govern them. It doesn't have an executive, doesn't have a judiciary, it has no foreign policy. It's 13 colonies trying to make decisions in the war. Some of you who know a lot about the Revolutionary War know that they were always short of revenue. Sure, 13 colonies agreeing on giving money to each other. 13 colonies which each raised their own militia, and many of which never let their soldiers go beyond their borders. You can see where this is going. They printed their own currency. Do you think Massachusetts would take the currency of some of the southern colonies? I don't think so. The point is, it was a mess. They didn't do well at all. Winning the Revolutionary War is one of the greatest miracles in American history. I really mean that. George Washington never won a battle. I hate to disillusion any of you. I don't want to disappoint you. So what did the delegates who went to Philadelphia in 1787 do? They were going to originally revise the Articles of Confederation. And what did they discover right away? It's non-revisable. It's non-reparable. They had to create something new. And they created the Constitution, which is a federal system, not a confederal system. The United States Constitution and its amendments and the laws that the United States Congress passes is over state law. States can create laws that govern the residents, but they can't contradict or violate federal laws. You are all citizens of the United States of America. You're not just citizens of the state of Florida. Ron DeSantis doesn't know that. I'm going to give you, let me do you two other quick history examples before I talk about Ron DeSantis. In the 1830s, there was a very important challenge by states' rightsers. Andrew Jackson was president. John C. Calhoun was one of the most prominent politicians in the country. He had been a senator, he had been a vice president, he was a senator again in the 1830s, and he came up with what he called the nullification idea. Some of you are shaking your heads, yes, you know what that is. What happened was the US Congress passed a high tariff. They passed the tariff because they're trying to encourage domestic manufacture. The southern states, as you know, export cotton to Great Britain, and they import finished products, furniture, china. In the 1830s, all that stuff, even some of it, Waterford, a lot of it is still better than ours, maybe. I don't know, I shouldn't say that. But they're still very good. The point is, John C. Calhoun, representing South Carolina, always a troubled state, representing South Carolina, develops his theory of nullification, which means if the federal government passes a law that contradicts or violates or upsets the state can nullify the law. President Jackson heard this, and he said, you got to be kidding. And he told John Calhoun, I'm going to send in the militia and close all of your ports if you don't pay the tariff and obey the U.S. law. Calhoun back up. That was the end of states' rights there. The most dramatic example of states' rights, of course, is the Civil War. What did the southern states say? But essentially, we're going to secede from the Union. And why are they going to do it? Even though Nikki Haley of South Carolina didn't know the answer to this question. They're going to do this in order to preserve slavery. States' rights is going to be used as the tool to defend slavery. I'd like to think this is an original idea. I don't think I hear people talking about this enough. After this, we can move to Ron DeSantis. I'm going to give you a few examples of his using quite aggressively the tool of states' rights, COVID. Initially, he obeys kind of the guidance. Remember, besides the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the amendments, the U.S. Congress, we have federal agencies created by Congress to do a variety of tasks. We have something called the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. These are the scientists. These are the experts. These are the students of epidemics. They're the ones who offered us the guidance. People like Dr. Fauci became well known, right? Well, if you're a states' rightser, at the beginning, DeSantis in the first year closed down the state, closed down the schools. But in the following year, in 2021, he hires as Surgeon General of Florida a doctor named Ladapo. Ladapo, who's still the Surgeon General of Florida, who said just a few months ago that the COVID vaccine shouldn't even be distributed in Florida anymore. I don't know if you know that. He said that. He is an outlier, but he is so far out in the medical profession that he's not really a medical person. He believes that the COVID vaccine is more dangerous than the COVID virus. He believes that the COVID vaccine has DNA in it, which when it enters your body, upsets your chromosomal system and causes cancer. There is no one in the establishment that accepts this view. The American Medical Association, the epidemiologists, the scientists, the doctors, whatever. He is operating in the dark, dark web with the conspiratorialists who are able to find conspiracies everywhere they look. As a result, DeSantis, he is DeSantis' ally in reopening the state of Florida earlier than many. But also he has another ally, whom I think you probably heard about last week, and that is Moms for Liberty. Wasn't that talked about, obviously, last week? Moms for Liberty, so I won't go into it, except to say that their first cause was against the vaccine, against masks, against having any kind of regulation of COVID. So he is an outlier, Ron DeSantis is, in the state, and arguing that the state can assert its own way of handling a pandemic, which is endangering the citizens of Florida and not allowing them to have the benefit of federal guidance in this area. I'm going to read you a sentence from DeSantis's 2023 State of the State address. That's a year ago. He says, I quote, "We rank number one for protections of our citizens against the biomedical security state." The biomedical security state. What is he talking about? He's talking about the big, bad federal government and that agency in Washington that's trying to tell them what to do. He says he's protecting the citizens of Florida from the biomedical security state. He's also protecting you all, and me too, I'm a citizen here, I'm a resident, from prohibiting jab or job mandates. Do you know about that? Jab or job mandates. A lot of private industry in the state of Florida told their employees properly they should get vaccinated. Jab, get vaccinated. And the threat was maybe they'd lose their job, or at least that's DeSantis's interpretation, that the big bad government in Washington is telling you that they are being protected against jab or job. And they're banning vaccine passports. Did you know that? I can remember only one time when I had to show my vaccine passport going into a public facility that wanted to know that you were vaccinated. But that's bad. You see, any federal regulation from his point of view was bad. He also urged Floridians to ignore the chattering class. He doesn't like the media. And the national media, as you well know, did not treat him well. He didn't do well on the presidential campaign. So his handling of the COVID vaccine and the COVID epidemic was different from what the federal guidelines had been. And that's an example, in my view, of states' rights. He's arguing that he can endanger the population in the state of Florida because he doesn't want to listen to the big government. You should know, in fact, that Florida is still among the lowest states in vaccination. And that's one reason why. Move on to another example of how he implies, or implements rather, states' rights over federal rights. The Medicaid program. Medicaid is a health insurance plan for low-income people. During the pandemic, the Biden administration expanded benefits, expanded the number of people who would be eligible for Medicaid. And invited all the states, you had to agree to it. 12 of the 50 states have not expanded Medicaid. Guess which is one of the 12 states? Further, in 2023, technically the epidemic, the pandemic was considered over. And so Florida required their Medicaid patients to, and this was something you had to do every year, but many of them who thought they were still covered weren't. Florida has disqualified, as if a few weeks ago that I read, 600,000 people from Medicaid. 600,000. It's a lot of people. The third example I would give is one that shows you how states' rights, when carried out and implemented in various ways, is very chaotic. And that is the overturning of Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court behaved in its Dobbs decision, from my point of view, as a states' rights decision. The Supreme Court said essentially, let the states decide on their abortion policy. Let the state decide whether you can ban abortion at 16 weeks, at 15 weeks, or now. Last year, Ron DeSantis, probably once again in his bid for the presidency, passed the ban of 5 weeks. Now that's in the courts right now, banning abortion after 5 weeks. But letting every state make this decision on their own, when we're talking about women's rights, I happen to be a historian of women also, women's rights, and women who are citizens of the United States of America, but if they live in Florida or other restrictive states, and for whatever reasons they have, these are difficult decisions, difficult, intimate decisions. These should not be public decisions. They may have to move to another state or travel to another state to see their rights allowed. So from my point of view, the underlying theme of the Ron DeSantis administration, which still has a few more years to go, although if you read his 2024 State of the State address, which he gave in early January, it's much more tepid and mild. He's not proposing new ideas. But now that he realizes at least his presidential ambitions are stamped out for at least this election, maybe he's going to continue on the culture wars path. Maybe he's going to expand in other areas as well. So I see states' rights as the primary philosophy of Ron DeSantis, and I see it as a very dangerous philosophy. And if all states go their own way, we are no longer the United States of America. And I think that is one of the headings that I'm hoping, a pathway we do not follow.
I'm convinced. But I would also add a caveat. It's also a feature of anti-intellectualism, anti-experts, anti-professionals, and that the idea, the Moms for Liberty, can say one parent, and only one parent, can deny you reading 200 books. You can't read the Bible. Ladies and gentlemen, according to this, you can't read the dictionary. I'm not making this up. There are a 3-letter word in the dictionary, S-E-X. That's how outrageous it becomes. One person and only one person can determine the legitimacy, not the professionals, not the teachers. That, to me, undergirds this whole idea, the states' rights. It's a feature of anti-intellectualism and so on. I wasn't going to talk about it, but I think we are supposed to comment on each other's too. Let me think about this. I'm going to talk about and compare Ukraine and Israel. And I'm going to say it this way and explain it. Russia, Ukraine, Hamas, Israel. Now, why do I do that? Because that's not normally the way it's done. I want the first word to be the attacker, the invader, in both cases. The invader of its next door neighbors. In each case, it's the same thing. And in each case, by the way, the perpetrator, the attacker, Russia in the one case and Hamas in the other, says that the victim, Israel and Ukraine, have no right to exist. They have no right to be an independent, sovereign country. Russia goes on about this all the time. Ukraine is really Russia. And Hamas in its charter, from the river to the sea, that's the Jordan River. I should be keying a map in a minute. Do I tell him that? I key the map. He's going to show the map of both Ukraine and Israel, so you're going to be able to see it. But before I do that, I want to tell a story because I think also it's interesting the kind of things that June is thinking about, but I also have the thought, geography is destiny. Ukraine has 7 nations bordering it. Israel has 5. We have 2. Think about the numbers. 7 different countries. I'm sorry, what am I supposed to say to get the
Map.
Are they? Oh, there they are. It's probably hard to see, but I'm going to say it, and you'll just, and there is sort of a line there. Let me though begin with a little story. The story goes that Moses was told that he was going to get a land that was incredible, that had snowy mountains in the north, warm southern sandy deserts in the south, a land of milk and honey, truly a promised land. And Moses was skeptical. This sounded too good to be true. So Moses said, "What's the catch?" And the response was, "Wait till you meet the neighbors." Wait till you meet the neighbors. It was applying to Israel, but isn't it true of Ukraine also? And isn't it true of so many weaker, smaller countries that are vulnerable to the attack of their next door neighbor? It's a watchword. Well, just wait till you meet the neighbors. So let me say Ukraine first. Ukraine, who its north, has Belarus, with its dictator leader, Lukashenko, who's the special friend, pal, ally, and compatriot of Vladimir Putin of Russia. Belarus is in the north. Russia is the east. The mammoth, approximately 140 million people in Russia, 40 million in Ukraine. Going to the west, you have Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. In the southwest, you have Romania and Moldova. Added up, 7 countries bordering Ukraine. Now, Poland has been the country of access, and Poland has received, when the Ukrainian war began in February of 2022, and virtually they're saying the number could be 1 million Ukrainians have left the country and are in Poland, which is an incredible responsibility and burden, obviously, for Poland. Not other places, because they are not going to Belarus. Russian troops were on that northern border as well. Israel has 5, as I said. In the north, Israel has, it's Ukraine, and I will do Israel. Israel has Syria and Lebanon in the north, Jordan in the east, Egypt in the south. And when the multiplicity of wars have taken place, and I'm going to say just a few words about it, it is also those countries that have invaded Israel too. Egypt in the south, needed, very necessary, but also Syria, Lebanon, and at times Jordan. Beyond, so I've mentioned 4 countries, but the 5th are the Palestinians, or you'd say the Arabs who live, and I'm not talking about the 20% of the population of Israel, 9 million people, 20% are the Arab Muslims. So they are citizens of Israel. They have all the rights of citizenship. They have members in the Supreme Court. They are doctors and lawyers and
In a separate justice system. They are tried by a military court. They are under a system of apartheid, by definition. They are in a separate judicial system.
If I may, the West Bank and Gaza are, but not the citizens of Israel.
They are being tried. They are tried.
Those are tried by the.
Please don't interrupt our speakers.
Don't.
My understanding is that the West Bank, you're absolutely correct. The West Bank has a military form of justice there, and that isn't, I have a problem with it too, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. But if you're a citizen of Israel, I would argue what one suggestion you're, I think, saying is they don't have total equal resources. And that's a true fact. That is, the Palestinian schools or the Arab schools within Israel do not necessarily have the full resources that others have, and that's a problem. There's no question that's a problem. So that but the West Bank is the West Bank of the Jordan River. It's the eastern side of Israel. Gaza is in the southwest on the Mediterranean. But what I was going to suggest is the charter of Hamas is from the river to the sea, and the river is the Jordan, I said this before, and the sea is the Mediterranean. And that they have had this, meaning that is their territory, that is their land. Now, historically, in both countries, Ukraine and Israel, they have a history that I am calling pockmarked by invasions and by war. It's been said about Ukraine from the 13th century on, for 600 years, invader after invader, the Mongolians, the Khazars, a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Tsarist Russians, then the Soviets, then the Nazis, who killed 7 million Ukrainians during the Second World War, and then the Soviet Union again, until in 1991, Ukraine is deemed independent as a result, of course, of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And Israel, throughout centuries, and actually thousands of years, Jews have inhabited, and many Arabs have also, the Holy Land, all through the years. But Israel gets its independence by the United Nations in 1948. And as many know, and there are different interpretations, I will grant this, but that in 1948, when the United Nations deemed that the Jewish people should get Israel, they also said there should be a division, and the Palestinians, and they didn't have that word Palestinians then anyway, but let's just say the Arabs should also have a role and have a place as well. The Arab groups The communities rejected it, and many were left on their own. Many were not left on their own, but were evicted indeed. And that's a whole story as well. But after the 1948 War of Independence, and the Israelis get their independence, just celebrated 75 years, you have a war in 1956. You have a Six-Day War in 1967. You have the Yom Kippur War in 1973. All invasions by Egypt and often Syria, sometimes Lebanon, sometimes Jordan, to the state of Israel. And so the present state, obviously, of Hamas, and now you have divided government, because in the West Bank you have the Palestinian Authority governing the West Bank, and in Gaza only Hamas. But it denies a lot of fact that has now erupted of the support for Hamas, not only in that part of the world, but across the globe, which is a whole other thing. Now, to go further then, the histories then are marked by violence of both countries and in very serious ways. Once again, both countries' next-door neighbors invaded them, and no question, both countries also said that they have no right, their victims have no right to exist. But let's go a step further. I think the perpetrators, the invaders, the attackers, are testing and intentionally did these invasions to test the will, the stamina, the staying power of the West. How long, says Mr. Putin, will the West continue to support Ukraine? How long will the United States continue to support Ukraine and or Israel? They'll give up soon, and we're already seeing, obviously, cracks in the support, and they were right. The bad guys were absolutely right in thinking about this as part of their plan. But the irony of ironies, that both of these wars should take place at the same time, because now Ukraine and Israel are competitors for the same kind of resources that the United States is going to offer, as well as the European Union. They need the same kind of artillery. And yet this war is really a new war that the military analysts will begin to talk about it. It's a war of digital intelligence. It's a war of drones. Yes, there are ground invasions, but drones and rockets and missiles, and they're still each firing at the other and still having the capability. But reading recent articles, and there was one in an English newspaper about the diminishing of resources in Ukraine in particular. Israel is running out of stuff too. But Ukraine is not only running out of munitions, it's running out of soldiers. They interviewed one commander in this article, and the commander said, one of our battalions, and we're on the front line, usually have 200 people. Now we're down to 35. Only 35 men are standing there between themselves, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. And this has been repeated, and the story goes, I have to believe this, that the reason that Volodymyr Zelensky just fired his general is the general wanted to recruit 500,000 more men, and Zelensky was afraid what would this do, that it would not be popular, it would not be feasible, and it's acknowledging a weakness also if you're going to call up recruits, etc. So there is clearly difficulty and dissension both in Ukraine, among the leaders and among what is going on, and certainly in Israel. And if I had to, well, I'll just continue though. But again, I think seminal point of both wars is hostages. And I think that this has been just the high tech, but the hostages are the situation. It seems to have vanished from the newspapers, but early on, in the description of what Russia was doing in Ukraine, they talked about how they gathered together, they kidnapped young people, teenagers. Do you remember reading that? The Russians kidnapped Ukrainian teenagers and put them in schools where they will be brainwashed to be good little Russians. There was a piece that was on public television or somewhere else that was incredible. A Ukrainian grandmother, was very attached to her grandson and couldn't live without him. She found some way to get into Russia and find the school and talk to the headmaster that was overseeing these Ukrainian children and convince the woman to release her grandson. So it was a good story. It was unbelievable, but there's only one person. But nobody has been talking about those hostages in Ukraine. But the 240 hostages that were originally taken, we're talking about men, women, children, babies, not even counting in their years, they're months old, older people, younger people, everywhere. And we have a very personal set of feelings which really upset us because we have a dear friend whose grandson is one of the captives, one of the hostages. And he's been his story, his name is Hirsch Goldberg Poland. And if you've been watching the news, Anderson Cooper features them, Lester Holt has featured them. And our friend's his son, he's the father of the child. And he was the young man who was in a shelter, and they machine gunned, and they threw bombs in, and so on. And Hamas has a video of this young man running from the shelter with half of his left hand gone. I mean, I can't even think about it. And our friend is ill now as a direct result of this stress-related, unbelievably tense and difficult moment. So the whole thing to be read through this of hostages, certainly in Israel, but also hostages in Ukraine. And I have to get this in because June was political. I was trying not to be, but I will. There is a candidate for president out there saying that the January 6th rioters are hostages. That's been said. He's used that word. How dare you? How dare you? January 6th rioters were rioters. They were insurrectionists. We saw it with our own eyes on television screens as it was unfolding. There is no second thinking about how you interpret it. To use words so dangerously, which we know, words can lead to action and lead to a lot of danger. But this is a terrible thing. Let me just conclude then in saying this, thinking about it. The leaders also have an interesting mixed reputations. Zelensky has emerged as a hero, a man who just a couple of weeks ago, January 25th, celebrated his 46th birthday. He had never had a political office before. He was elected in 2019 after having a very, very popular television show where he was pretended to be the president of an imaginary country, and it was called, that's right, it was called, it was something of the people. What is it? The service of the, servant, that's the word. Thanks, Ellen. Servant of the people. You know, it was a joke that he was going to be the president. And lo and behold, in 2019, he's the leading candidate, and he wins. Any American politician would die for this. He wins with 73% of the vote. This 46-year-old television comedian becomes president. And lo and behold, that's 2019. How he would know that a mere 2+ years later, he would be leading a country against a nuclear nation that had the power to destroy everything that he knew to be dear. He's a Russian speaker. He was raised, and his parents are academics. His father's an academic. His mother was an engineer. Very interesting man, very interesting background, and clearly is trying to rise to the occasion. What a contrast. He's an ingenue, never held political office. And in Israel, you have Bibi Netanyahu, who is the longest-serving Israeli prime minister in history in 2 or 3 different times, total of 16 years. And he will be deemed, because your tributes, your obituaries, sad to say, are your last events. And people forget what else you did in your life, but they remember the last, especially that he was overseeing a country that laid itself bare, was so vulnerable to Hamas, underappreciating, always undervaluing, under-respecting your enemy in such a serious way. To have breached the security, they knew exactly which cameras were doing which surveillance, to use, again, high tech, and to be so sophisticated and coming in with the paragliders overhead, nobody knew what was happening. Just not unlike ours 9/11. Condoleezza Rice said she had a report on her desk that there was some possible murmurings that there was going to be a plot and so on. They thought, no, they could never, 2 Arabs couldn't coordinate anything. They could never cooperate. They could never do it. The Israelis made the same mistake. That what did they think was going on? Qatar was giving Hamas over $1 billion a year. What were they doing with it? The people of Gaza looked as if they had no improvements in their lives, in the infrastructure. They were building tunnels. Gaza is only, 8 or 9 miles long? They have 350 miles of tunnels? It's unbelievable, unimaginable, but that this is where we are. So the one now is considered a bum, and the other is still a hero. and how is the world looking. And our own politics play into this, of course. It's in America's national security, because the final point that I will make is the real worry, which is already erupted in the Middle East, is that these particular conflicts will spread and become regional, which it is already in the Middle East. Here you have the Houthis, who are Shia. Just so you know, in a country, Yemen is mostly, the leadership is Sunni, but Houthi is Shia. Hamas is Sunni. And of course, the Hezbollah in Lebanon is also Shia. Iran is Shia. And why does Iran have connections with Hezbollah? They're like-minded, Shia. With Houthi, they're like-minded, they're Shia. Why are they with Hamas? It's the old political adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so therefore, Hamas, being the enemy of Israel, is Iran's friend, because Iran obviously wants to eradicate this. Anyway, so with that said, I think we're going to continue now with more discussion of Israel.
Our time is growing short, so I want to talk about one particular theme that has to do with why did public opinion worldwide be sympathetic to Israel on day one, and then by day three, they were pro-Palestinian. It was a very sudden, and it happened even before Israel started bombing. Israel took a few weeks before it started the bombing. But the opinion of the world changed. And I would argue, once again, to give you a little history, it was 1967. In the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, Israel was unbelievably successful. It captured, probably the best part it captured was East Jerusalem. So they reunited Jerusalem. If you've ever seen the pictures of the Israeli paratroopers going to the wall, to the what was called the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, the last wall of the Second Temple. They also captured the West Bank of the Jordan River, which had been Jordanian. Jordan had been the administrators of East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And the Gaza Strip and Sinai were the properties, the colonial possessions of Egypt. So they defeated Egypt, they defeated Jordan, and now Israel was expanded. Nobody, frankly, it's a dirty little secret, nobody wanted Gaza. Gaza is a difficult, although it didn't have to be this way, but it was. And Israel occupies Gaza as well as these other places. And in 1967, the left in the world, the politically left-wing movements in all European countries and in this country changed their image of Israel. From 1948 until 1967, Israel is a small country kind of minding its own business, trying to stay out of trouble. Although I'll just correct one little thing Joyce said. 1956, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt in order to reopen the Suez Canal. And they failed. It was a failed war. But that was the only time when they acted in that way. But from 1948 until 1967, 19 years, Egypt and Jordan play a major role in the area. After 1967, if you look at Marxist literature, for example, or socialist literature of the time, after 1967, Israel is now a colonial power. It is now, nobody called Egypt a colonial power, or Jordan a colonial power. But now Israel is an imperialistic, Western colonial power, as bad as the empires of Britain or France or Germany or the Ottomans or the Habsburgs or whoever. Israel is, in other words, part of the colonial power, part of the victimizers in the world. And that became the lexicon from 1967 on. And what's happened in current times, so that you see this pro-Palestinian outburst, is a new generation among Americans. Gen Z, those kids born in 1996 all the way to 2015, who are often now the college kids. They are the largest generation in American history, 27% of the American population, the most diverse, more than half are minorities. They are the most committed to social justice. Think about the Greta Thunbergs of the world and the Parkland kids against guns, against violence, pro-environment, anti-aggression. So you have the minority are now college students who are part of Gen Z, raised on the belief, in a sense, that Israel is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And so within days, you have this pro-Palestinian outburst. And the argument they forget is that, first of all, Palestine is a very fraught word to use in this case. The Arabs in Gaza, as well as the Arabs in Israel, are people who came at various times, but primarily in the late 19th and the 20th century. Jews have been there, not the majority, by no means, but there's been a continuous population of Jews in Israel going back to Roman times. The Romans are the ones who created the label for that piece of land. They called it Palestine. It's a Latin word. So anybody who lived there, and I have done research on the Jews in the 1910s and 20s, mainly the 1920s, in Palestine. They called themselves Palestinian Jews. You had Palestinian Jews, you had Palestinian Arabs, you had Palestinian Christians. You had a big Christian population. And you had Palestinian, Muslims, as I said. So it is a fraught subject. Personally, as a Zionist, as I am troubled. I talked about how the world is in a fraught situation. I'm not happy with the way things are going. I'm not happy with seeing children die, whether they're children who are Arab children or Jewish children. I don't want any children to die. I don't want war. But Israel has a right to exist. Thank you.
Let's stay there. Yeah.
We want to entertain any questions or comments you may have now.
And we have avoided talking about the politics within this country, but maybe I'll just make one observation before you begin. We have a two-party system, as we know, and the two parties have different views on foreign aid now, which is fascinating. The Republicans used to be the internationalists. They were always involved in the world. Read Ronald Reagan. He really very much wanted the world that we, the United States, is and was and are the only reliable powers to be in the world, and that we are the most reliable. And so we have the Republicans now who are reticent to give aid to Ukraine, and some Democrats are reluctant to give aid to Israel. So we have a mixed bag in the United States, and the world is looking at us. They really are. But thankfully, the European Union did step up to give Ukraine $54 billion last week. But it's not enough. They're not able to pay salaries with it. It's just resources, and they are really desperate. Without the resources of the United States, Ukraine could fall to that evil, evil guy, Vladimir Putin. How I don't understand how any party can't understand it's our national security that is direly affected by what these decisions are. Any questions, comments? Yes?
Could you please comment on this dispute that's taking place between the federal government and the state of Texas with regard to who has control over this bit of the land on the Rio Grande?
That's a good one.
That is a perfect example of Greg Abbott, and I didn't want to get into that, but Greg Abbott is another states' rights aggressor. And by denying the federal marshals the right to go in to the Border Patrol, the federal Border Patrol can't go into that El Paso area where Greg Abbott, first of all, he put razor wire, along the border, and the Supreme Court said he can't bring that down. But he's still putting his state National Guard there, not letting the Border Patrol go there. I don't know what the federal government's going to do about this, but he's violating federal law. You're right. But it's another example of states' rights doing what they want to do. When you have the government of one state being of one political party and the other one of another political party, given this polarized country, we haven't talked at all about that, but given this polarized country, we're at a standstill right now. Thank you for the comment.
First of all, I want to, is this on? Yes. I want to thank you for such an informed presentation and for talking about the important issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's really great to hear people describing what's really going on. However, I really feel like you left out a big chunk, and I'm shocked, actually, that you did. And that is the difference in leadership between what Zelensky's doing and what Netanyahu is doing in how they respond to being attacked. Now, you touched on it, but you didn't really point out the fact, and the reason that so many people, not only Gen Z, but many of us, I think, are upset is that they're massacring people in Palestine. They're massacring people, and they're using the same exact tactics that were used against them. Whereas in Ukraine, they aren't. They're defending their country. They're defending their own space. And there's a big difference in that leadership, and that's probably why the world has turned against Netanyahu, not against Israel and not against the right to exist, but against the way that that leadership is responding to the aggression.
May I?
Go ahead.
I think that's a very sound and solid and agreeable point. I think the history, though, gives us a partial answer. There's never been such a violent attack or that many Israelis killed in a single day since the Holocaust. Israel was formed to think it was a bastion of safety and security, and not understand they had so many wars. I'm not justifying what he's doing now. I've always disagreed with Bibi Netanyahu anyway. He's not at all. I think he should have been gone a long time ago. So I don't think, but I understand, because the terrible truth is when polls are taken in Israel, the majority of Israelis don't want him, but they want the bombing. They want to be able, it's ridiculous, because they're never going to be able to eliminate Hamas. A new Hamas, a new name, a new group will emerge. There's no question about it. And he's got to do something to stop it. I want him to stop it so that we get the hostages. And again, I weep every night to see children being killed. I think the numbers have got to be not necessarily that high, but they're terrible. And he's terrible to do this. And I think they should have called an election now, get him gone, and then they would change their military policy. I would like to think that that would be. I totally agree. It's a different story, though. Zelensky is trying to save his country from a large aggressor who's coming in. This was supposedly little Hamas. And Israel has the capability. Israel's a nuclear nation also. So is Russia. But Ukraine was too, by the way. They gave up their nuclear weapons when they left the Soviet Union. It's an interesting story, but that's neither here nor there. I agree with you that they are gone, that the world now sees it in a real daily way, how awful things are. And therefore, I was in no way, I said he was a bum. Remember in my discussion of Zelensky was a hero and Netanyahu was a bum, but I didn't go far enough. We would be very sympathetic to your point.
I would like to just make one other comment. I think it's a no-win situation for Israel. I think what they're doing is terrible. But think about it. Hamas hides, when Israel said Hamas is under the hospitals, they were right. They're in the tunnels, they're there. They shield behind the kids in school. What do? Israelis, I mean, they're being threatened with they see this as existential. And we're talking about the kibbutzim that they all slaughtered were all peaceniks. These were the people who went into Gaza and took the wounded and the sick, those who had cancer, and took them to Israeli hospitals. That's who they slaughtered. So you've got to understand how they feel. It's a no-win situation, I think. I mean, I'm not, it's terrible what's happening. But I see it from their point of view also. People who were always for a two-state solution. Israel is no longer for a two-state solution. And why not? Because of this. and they just don't see the, obviously it's Hamas is the primary, and the guy who's the head of Hamas now, Sinwar, whom they're looking for, that's who they're looking for down in Rafah. Sinwar was in an Israeli jail for murdering Jews for 20 years, and he was released in an earlier prisoner release. So that's the guy who's now leading the massacre against the Jews. So it's a terrible situation.
Yes, sir.
Well, Joyce, somebody else is.
Oh. I'm sorry. I didn't.
Joyce?
Yes, ma'am.
I want to thank you for an excellent, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Very fascinating. And having just been in Israel myself last June, just before the devastation occurred, the second Nakba, we believe that there was a problem, a big problem with the Arab citizens of Israel, because they were not really allowed to live in the more affluent areas, although that is beginning to change. So I don't support apartheid there, but I do support the idea that the Arabs were differentially treated, even though they were citizens of Israel. Second point, I'm going to the Supreme Court discussion on... I'm going to the Supreme Court discussion on...
The time is getting away, don't say anything.
I'm sorry?
You dealt with so many interesting things. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court's discussion of the Colorado exclusion of Trump from the ballot, and realize that was a decision of it hasn't been taken yet, but it seems that their decision is going to be that this is not a good idea. It's impractical because it could have horrible consequences with other states that are very pro-MAGA excluding Biden from the ballot. So it's a no-win situation.
Terrible.
And that is a better decision of the Supreme Court, if they take it, of the Supreme Court than their Roe v. Wade thing, which is endorsing states' rights.
Thank you.
Anyway, that's what
Thank you.
That's a good point. Do we have time for one more question or one?
Hello, yeah, hello.
Let us have
Hello,
the
wait,
young
is this
man.
thing on? You guys hear me? Okay, so let's just start. I've taken some notes, and they're just going to be in chronological order for the most part.
Wait a minute.
So-
I'm going to interrupt. This is not an opportunity for speeches. If
This
you
isn't
have
a speech. This is a series of comments. Okay, so let's just go through these quickly then. So, first of all, the notable claim that the river to the sea is a Hamas chant. No, it was created before Hamas, and it is a reaction to Netanyahu's party. Sorry, I just need to find the pronunciation here.
It's in
Of
the
the
charter.
Likud party.
It's in the Hamas charter.
Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. So, of course, it's a parody of that. Claims that the term Palestinian did not exist in 1948, of course, which it did. You later contradicted yourself
I didn't
on
say
that.
it didn't exist.
Well, you said that the word didn't exist, that the
No,
term
I
Palestinian.
didn't.
No,
I said the word was formed by the Romans and it's existed all
this is
along.
before-
but it
you said that
included
after,
it
yes.
included everybody who lived there.
I'm going to call a halt to this. This is not the purpose of what our forum is about. I'm sorry for interrupting
okay,
you.
so, okay.
We'll let
me
him
just
make
get-
one more.
okay.
You have the right to speak, but it's a Q&A session. Do you have a question for them?
But we would love to have you back as a speaker next season.
Okay, well, next season, okay.
I'm quite genuine.
So
about
I'd like
that.
to ask you here, so look in this room real quick. So how many young people are here represented here? Who would consider themselves young in here? Yeah, that's fine. You guys consider yourselves young all you want. But let's ask the disparity. Why exactly is this such a age-related issue on who supports who? Let's ask that question. That is a question. Yeah. Well, no, that is a question.
That's a good question.
I'm not questioning.
One other comment we'd had from the audience. Do you have any suggestions on what we can do as individuals and as a congregation to try to address the questions that you've raised today?
I'm sorry. What? Oh, what can you do? Well, I think we all should be well informed. so that we'll all be on the same page. We're saying a reflection of where we are today is we have alternate news sources, and we really have alternate facts. If you watch one news channel, you think it's this, and if you watch others, it's that. And they're direct contradictions of each other. So you have to read multiple. You must know multiple sources. That's the only way. And then think about which organization you think will best serve the global, noble purposes that we want to see happen. And the influence, there's a fly here, the influence that is, it's very difficult. As June said, I just don't see, Netanyahu has to go. But I think that there has to be somebody on the other side. Maybe this hasn't been said. Who will be the Palestinian Arab leader to speak in a different way? And my nomination, which I haven't said, is Marwan Barghouti. Do you all know who Marwan Barghouti has been in Israeli jails also? He still is there for helping kill Israelis 25 years ago. He's fluent in Hebrew. He's a very smart guy who knows what's going on, has learned the political system. He learned about Israelis, and he would be, and I think in the early days, I remember when Tom Friedman wrote his first book called From Beirut to Jerusalem, he talked about Marwan Barghouti, that's in the 70s, that he was a reliable person that Israelis could work with. So I first want to hear who on the other side is a voice that can be heard and respected, and we should look into that and talk and see what the communities. What can you do in Florida?
Well,
elections.
There is an organization that is a counter to Moms for Liberty. It's called something like Moms for Democracy. I think you should look for organizations, lobbying groups, or become your own lobbying group. Why not organize your own lobby? It's in Tallahassee. Right now, the impression I'm getting is that DeSantis is losing some of his power. The legislature was supine. You know, they began to resent the fact that he pushed through 70 laws against trans. We haven't talked, you know, I didn't even talk about that. Against trans and targeting minorities of a minority. So if I'm right, that the legislature is going to grow a spine, even the Republicans, not the most extreme Republicans, but are there any moderate Republicans in the Florida legislature? I don't know.
I don't know, but letters to the editor in the Naples Daily News run 9-1 against DeSantis. This is right here in his home territory.
That's interesting.
And I got it right here.
We will believe you.
So, do you hope we're being sold a bill of goods by the money, by the big money, the for-profit media, and the nonprofits are the ones.
Thank you very much. Wonderful audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for coming. Really appreciate your time. Again, next week we'll have a representative from the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee talking about the programs of UUSC.